All right, so for the mini room and everything going forward, like I mentioned before, I'm not going to specifically go over lighting, materials, cameras, and rendering unless there's something new. Everything else will be inside of that lights, materials, cameras, and rendering. So the process of how do you light your scene, look at the lights one. How do you assign materials and change them, look at the materials one. Same thing with cameras and rendering. Each one of those videos goes through an assortment of different lighting situations and setups. Same thing with the cameras and same thing with rendering. Your job is to be able to apply that information to whatever assignment we're working on. So in the mini room, I don't specifically show, here's how to add cameras, render it out, and so on. You would look at those videos and then apply it to the mini room stuff. Same thing with the titles. I kind of quickly go through it, but there's a more in-depth area up here. We're going to be starting on the environment assignment next week, okay? Even though we're working on the titles still, the environment one we're going to start planning for and start working on so that while one's rendering, we can work on this one. So just so you can see some examples, I create one windmill and I can move it around and rotate the blades. I create one cloud and I can duplicate it and have a whole bunch of them. Okay, same thing with the plants, the rocks, whatever it is. So you want to be able to start sketching out what kind of design you want for yours. It's going to be a floating island type situation, so it's very centralized just to the one thing, so you don't have to build this big world. So think about the items that you want to have on there, what kind of story you want to tell. Okay. Next week we'll actually start this, so as you're working on your title rendering and getting those situated, then you can start working on this stuff. Cool. Questions on the planning part? No, pretty straightforward. Here are some different titles. I kind of collected all of my titles into one file here, and then we can see all the different ways. The idea with this assignment is to not only go through the process of working with text in Cinema, but also how do we animate it, how do we make it look appealing, how do we render it out, and then getting used to that process. That process will not go away. We will always be rendering something out, whether it's a still or a video or a whatever. I've shown some of these before, obviously. There's a splashy one. All right, that one's taking too long, so we're just going to skip that one. That's just a squiggle one again. There we go, and then that one. Okay, so some of these are, like I've talked about before, Houdini. This is a Houdini render. You might be able to do that in Cinema. I have no idea how to do it in Cinema. It's something that's like a Houdini trick. But these ones are all done in Cinema. This is done in Cinema. This one's done inside Cinema. Okay, so I'm going to go over just a couple more techniques today. And that way today will be, the rest of today will be a work day. Next class will be a work day, and then Monday we'll start back and get back into the stuff, okay? The idea with all of these is just to, make it look fun. It shouldn't just be like, boom, boom, here's the text. It should have some excitement to it when you work on it, because even though I've done these for years, I still get excited when I make something that looks cool. Like that one there I thought was pretty cool. It took forever to render. And then this one here I thought was cool too. Oh, come on. What are you doing to me? There? Oh, I was trying to cache it, that's why. There. Okay, and you can obviously see the difference in these horrible backgrounds where there is no background color, and the ones where there are, this is unpleasant, this is nice, right? Same thing there, that's nice and pleasant, that's unpleasant. All right, so once Cinema opens, there we go. We'll go through a couple more techniques. I'm going to create my text just like we've done before. And again, don't be stuck on, I need to get the perfect font before I move on. Obviously, get something that's going to work similar to what you want, but you can always come back and adjust it to get the actual perfect font. Let's say I use that one. All right, so one of the techniques that we've covered before is using the effectors, and then using the plane there, that's how we can animate individual letters. We could also use the poly effects to break the letters apart into little pieces and then put them back together. The next one I want to show is this Voronoi fracture. For me, when I got into 3D, that was one of the things that really drove me to make cool stuff, is being able to break things and put them back together. And this Voronoi fracture is one of those tools that allows us to do that. So it's a green tool, which means it's going to be above the text, right? So the text will be inside it. This basically will take whatever geometry we have and break it into a bunch of pieces. If we click on this, there's a whole bunch of settings here. So basic and coordinate, you'll see this on pretty much all objects. They have this basic and coordinate tab, and then some will have an object tab, and then the rest is specific. So the first thing I'm going to jump to is sources. And here, the way that this fracture is working is it's creating a bunch of tiny points, and it's connecting those points in a way that cuts the surface up. So if I say show all used points, you can see all these points that are on the surface here. The difference or the distance between these and those and the averages and whatever formula it creates, it does that, okay? So the takeaway from this is that the more points we have, the more pieces we'll have, okay? So if I click on this point generator and I scroll down to the point amount, it's set to 20. If I set it to 100, oops, if I type in 100, there we go, I get more points. Now, anytime we have more points with anything, more divisions, it's going to take longer to render, it's going to take longer to simulate, all that other stuff. So just be aware of that. It also colorizes the pieces. This way you can kind of see what the pieces are going to look like or what the shape of them is. Under Object, I can turn that off if I wanted to, but then I can't see the pieces, so I always keep that on until I'm ready to go. Some other things that we may want to play with. This gets really in-depth. I'm not going to go into every detail that you can do in here, but there's a whole lot of stuff you can do just inside the sources as far as how the points are distributed. Instead of getting these nice even pieces or, chunky pieces, you can get basically like strips of pieces, which is really neat. You can do it vertically, horizontally, whatever. You can drive this all by a shader. So if you had a gradient that was really dark in the middle and light on the outside, you would get more points on the outside and less in the middle. So you can really customize what that looks like. Past softwares couldn't do something like this. Basically, in other softwares, if you broke something, it was just broke and you couldn't go back and update it and tweak it and modify it. This allows you at any point to just go back and tweak what those points are doing, okay? Which again is fantastic for what we're doing. I could also say create points per object. And instead of creating 100 points for the entire thing, it's going to create 100 points per object. On my text, if I say create single object, it's treating the whole thing as one object, but if it's not clicked, it's going to treat each letter as an individual letter, or as an individual object, okay? Again, something to pay attention to. Sometimes you'll get a distribution of points that might be heavily in the middle and not so much on the outside, and you want to make sure it's pretty even. You can control how the points are distributed here, so you can play with these, adjust them, tweak them. I'm going to go to detailing. Now, we're not going to be able to see what this does until the letters are actually like separated. So I'm going to go under MoGraph, I'm going to go to Effectors, and I'm going to do a push apart. And that does exactly what you think it does. It pushes the letters apart. So we can't see it because it pushed it too far. So I'm going to take the strength of this and just pull it down. Okay, I want it right about there. There we go. Okay. So two things I want to pay attention to. One, this is not a solid object. Even though it broke, it's basically just like sheets of paper that are broken. That could be a cool way to render this out as sheets of paper or broken shards. The one that I have here, this one, that's how this one was rendered out, is just having those pieces being broken off as just little chips. I'm going to go to my fracture. I'm going to go to my object. No, where am I going to go? Nope, I'm going to go to my text. There it is. Go to my caps and say create single object. Now that does two things. It also creates solid pieces here. Okay, so not only does it make all the pieces as one for the points, but it also makes them a solid chunk. If this is off on the text, it's pieces of paper. If this is on, then I get chunks there. okay? So I'm going to leave that on. I'm going to go back to my fracture. I'm going to go back to my detailing, and I'm going to click on this Enable Detailing. And what this will do is it'll add more resolution to each one of these pieces. Basically, before it was creating, let's say, just perfect squares that it was like pulling out of there. With the detailing, we're able to create deformed insides so that it's kind of like jaggedy, okay? Imagine you break apart a rock. It wouldn't be like perfectly smooth. It'll be jagged on the inside, so that's where you would get this kind of neat look. All the settings for this are down here. So once you click on, let's say, Enable Detailing, you can control how big the maximum edge length is. You'll see this throughout lots of tools. The smaller the edge length, the more detail you have. Okay, the maximum edge length is 10, so it's this big. If the maximum is 2, that means that all my pieces are going to be a lot more detailed. A lot more detail means a lot more divisions, which means longer render times, but, oops, and slower working. But if I zoom in here, I can see a bit more detail. I'm also going to go into my noise strength, take the global scale down to, let's say, 100. Let me click off so I can see it. That might be too low. You can definitely see there's a lot more distortion on the inside of this. That's way too much distortion. Let's take this turbulence up to 500. Okay, so now I have a little bit less in there. That's cool. All right. What else? I could also do geometry glue. So sometimes you may want certain pieces or some pieces to actually be glued together. This creates a nice organic shape to your stuff. Instead of each of these being tiny pieces like this, you may have like this top chunk of the C that's all stuck together. And so as it breaks and falls apart, it would create these nice shapes. Now again, all of these things are things that you should just look at and play with as you get used to them. I'm going to turn the push apart off. I'm going to turn detailing off. These are two things that are going to slow down my station as I'm doing this. And let me center my text because I don't like how it's off there. There we go. Okay. I'm going to scoot the text up a little bit. And this is one of the things I'll do with text like this. I'll go to my tags, I'll go to simulation tags, and I'll make this a rigid body. And we talked about these probably the first day or second day we got into cinema. Oops. I'm going to make my ground here. This is not my file I'm rendering in, so I don't have all my stuff that I typically would have. I'm going to make the ground a colliding object, and then I'm just going to hit play. And then it just falls apart. Okay. Now some of the properties that I may want to adjust. Let me go back to my floor and take the bounciness down to, let's say, 5% and the friction up to 75. Okay. Bounce is bounciness. Friction is like how easily it's going to slide. Lots of friction means it's very rough like sandpaper. Less friction means it's more like ice. Okay. I'm going to take it also on the Voronoi fractures collision here, same thing. So 5 and let's say 75. It just looks weird when they slide like that. So now it kind of clumps in the middle. Okay. That's cool. I'm just going to throw that geometry glue on now so you can see how this is going to work. I'm going to set it up to point distance and let's say 12. There we go. All right, so now I hit play. What was that? The floor is a collider object. Yep. So now what we're seeing here is that it's actually popping. When I put that glue on, this geometry glue, and I set the point distance, it basically made some of the pieces basically touching each other. So the second I hit play, they push apart. Because they're dynamic, they just move apart. So maybe I need to lower this, let's say 5. That's a little bit better. Okay. And now we'll get, it's very similar to the last one. Let's go see if we can find a happy medium here. Let's say 10. It's not too bad. Okay. Yeah, if I do that, it's just all the same letter. That didn't do anything. And glue rest. That was when they were all clicked on bigger. So the C is going to roll because it's round, right? And then part of the A apparently fell off too, like right there. I don't know why it did that. Okay, so it's something to play with inside here, right? Maybe cluster will give us better results. Nope. Let's take 10. So now this is going to cluster 10 pieces together. But you can see you get much different results than you would have otherwise. These pieces are not the nice uniform pieces that we had a minute ago. Now, one thing we can do to kind of hold off all the dynamic stuff, because right now what's happening is because they're colliding, they're just throwing apart. So I'm going to go to my dynamics. I'm going to go to dynamics here and say I want you to trigger, let's say on collision. It'll probably do it already because it's already colliding. Nope, it's not okay, good. And then I'm going to have an object just collide with it. Okay, so let's go shrink this down. I'm going to rotate. All right, so I'm going to have this object just hit it so that it basically will trigger the dynamics and then it'll explode. So I'm just going to go here. I'm going to go to my coordinates, set a position keyframe, go to, let's say, 60, and set a position keyframe. Okay. Now this is not going to actually collide with it. Okay. As far as the software is concerned, these two things are not talking to each other. I have to make sure that this is also a collider object. And now when I hit play, it'll mow it down. Okay. Maybe I want this to be rotated a little bit more so it's not so drastic, so it barely touches it maybe. There we go. Now, you might get some weird stuff if you do this because of how it's set up. If one of those pieces that's sitting there doesn't get touched by another object, it'll still stay sitting there. It'll like float in space. I'm going to turn that glue off because it's a little bit more picky about that. And then I'm going to hit play and we'll see if everything, oops, try that again. There we go. So you'll see the very top of the C, that didn't get hit. So it's just sitting there floating. So this is one of the things that frustrates some people with dynamics is that you do have to play with it to get the right result. It's not a matter of saying I want this to happen and this to happen. We're pushing the software to do what we want it to do. And so sometimes we have to change the parameters to get what we want. Okay, so that's a neat way to do that. Now, I would not render this out. I would just turn this off. You can turn stuff off to not render by clicking this button here. The top one is display. Don't display it, it's in red. The bottom one is render. So if I hit Control R, we won't see that box there. If the bottom box is on and I hit Control R, we will see it. Okay? So some items you will just have there just to trigger stuff like this. And then other items, obviously, we want them to actually be visible. All right, so that's one way you could animate something like that happening. I'm going to delete the cube. I'm going to rewind this. Another way I could do something dynamic is if I just go to my trigger here, and the trigger basically is like, when is it dynamic? If I said at velocity peak, that means when it hits a certain velocity, then start moving. So I hit play, nothing happens. I like to verify every step of the way. I'm going to go to my fracture. I'm going to go to MoGraph. And that same plane effector that we added before, I'm going to add to this. So essentially what I want to do is, as that plane effector pushes it up, that should give it enough velocity that at some point it's going to actually turn dynamic. That's the hope. So I'm going to go to my fall off. I'm going to go to linear. And same thing, I'm just going to animate this going from one side to the other. I think I want to swap that around to -X. There it is. And just set a keyframe. Now I'm only moving in the X direction, so I'm just going to hit X this time. There we go. Okay, so I'll rewind it and hit play. And so now it shoots up, it gets that speed, and then it just falls down. Now I could adjust those settings. I can go back to my dynamics. I can go back to my at velocity peak and say custom, not custom initial velocity. I'm going to shrink this. That's what I'm going to do. If I shrink this, I take the plane and tell it to only go up to, let's say, 5. That might move it up just enough that I get the effect without it going up too far. Right? So now it's just kind of like hitting it and making it dynamic. Now my one, I actually, instead of it pushing up, I pushed it forward. So I went, instead of the Y direction, I pushed it in the negative Z. And what this will do is it'll push it towards the screen, and so it falls down forward, which again is a nice way to kind of show that off. And you don't get this look of, I see something has hit it, but I don't see that thing actually happening, right? Which is usually something that looks kind of fake. This looks pretty neat how it's falling. Okay, so just based off of that, you can do a whole lot of different things to that. This one here is done just like that, okay? It's done, basically I'm triggering this using those same things, using a linear field to control each piece of this. This one here was done the same way. It just explodes like crazy. It's like way too much stuff to even see. This one, not only does the linear push it up, but it also scales the pieces down, okay? So it pushes it up, scales the pieces down, and then they're dynamic, so you actually get like two basic like looks to this thing. And then this one is, again, that same way. It's just pushing it forward. I think that's the only one I had that on. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Now, here's another nice thing about this Voronoi. I'm going to assign a material to it, so I'm going to turn the colorized fragments off. I'm going to drop this onto that. And I'm going to give this a color of, just so that we can see this, I'm just going to give it like a blue color here and a very diffused color. There we go. All right, so there's my blue. All right. Now, I did not put a bevel on this. Everything updates, so I can go back to my fillet here and add my fillet cap. It goes crazy, just like it always does. We'll just adjust our settings. There we go. It's good. I'll rewind it and hit play just to make sure everything still works and nothing, goes too crazy. Now that all works good. Cool. So now, this is where it gets fun. Let's say that I have a material on the outside of this I want to be one color, but a material on the inside I want to be a different color, okay? In regular objects, you can just grab faces and assign colors to them, and that works. For a Voronoi, you can actually go to selections and you can save selections. So it'll remember what are the inside faces, what are the outside faces. So I'm just going to click these two, and I'm going to make another material. And just for contrast, I'm going to take this one and make this less reflective and super shiny. And I will make it red, sure. Okay. So I'm going to drop this onto Voronoi as well. Now I have two materials on here. Currently, it's only going to show the top far right one. Okay, just this far right one. Down here on that selection is where I get to pick where those materials are set up to. So if I hover my mouse over this one, it says outside faces. If I hover my mouse over this one, it says inside faces. I want this shiny to be on the inside, so I drag this selection down to here. And so now the inside of it will be shiny. I'll go to the blue, drag the outside to outside. You have to make sure that you click on the Voronoi and then go to selections and add those in. Okay, so now we're back to the blue. I'm going to hit play. And then if we render it now, we'll see that the outside is blue and the inside is red. Okay, so you can do, again, a whole lot of different things just based off of that one tool. Okay, and that's adding dynamics to it as well. It doesn't have to have dynamics. I just like dynamics because I think they're awesome. Especially because that animation is adjusted by just changing one number. There. Now it's -50. So now it's going to shoot towards the camera a lot more, right? Or if I want to go, let's say 30, and then I want to push it up a little bit, so now it's going to arch towards the camera, right? And that's something cool to have on your stuff too, because let's say my camera is right here, okay? And these pieces like slide right against the camera. That might be a cool way to add, let's say, depth of field to my scene, and now I have this cool depth of field look to my stuff where it's like blurry here and in focus there, or vice versa. Again, you can create a bunch of cool stuff with this. Now, anytime you work with dynamics, you have to cache it out, okay? As I start to play with this, if I go like this, back and forth, you can see it has no idea what to do, and it just starts breaking the letters, and this is not what my animation is. it needs to calculate at frame 0, where is it at, then frame 1, then frame 2, then frame 3. Every time we hit play, it has to go through that order to do that, regardless of what kind of dynamics we're doing, okay? So let's pretend that I'm perfectly happy with the way this is looking. I'm going to go to my Dynamics tab. I'm going to go to Cache, and I'm going to hit Bake All. What this does is it goes frame by frame and writes out every single frame of what that frame is doing dynamically. So now I can click and drag, and that animation will play back perfectly every single time. Now we need to do this because when we render these out, we are going to have, change this to physical. We're going to have motion blur on these, and in order to have motion blur on these, we have to be able to read multiple frames at once. So when it goes to frame, let's say 40, it's going to look at frame 39, look at frame 40, and look at frame 41 to see how these pieces are moving so it can create that motion blur. And if we don't have that motion blur step set up, we won't get it. I thought I clicked it on. I did. Yes. There it goes. It wouldn't render in the regular view. It's going to render in this one. Now this is why the due date for this one is so long in the future, because of how long this process is going to take. Especially if you get into something like this. If you just do thin pieces, all MoGraph stuff where there's no dynamics, no Voronoi, any of that stuff, it doesn't take too much time. When you get into this, it does take a lot of time to render out. Just as a, for instance, D drive, P drive. What class is this? Titles, here we go. All right, so here is this one rendering. This took 13 minutes a frame for all those tiny things, okay? That's all, 13 minutes a frame. Motion blur is on there, and ambient occlusion is on there, just like I said in the thing. The other one, this one, took 36 minutes per frame, okay? So these will take time to render. If you don't have the software at home, get the software at home, or plan on coming to lab to render these things out. Because if you came in on a Friday, or even a Thursday night, there's a class in here at 5 to 8, you stayed after 8 o'clock, you rendered your stuff out, you would have all night Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday and Sunday, should be done by the time you get in on Monday. Okay, those basically, that's how long they took to render out. I believe if I look at my Explode Forward one, details, I started this one on 2/8, which was what, Saturday? Not Friday. I started that on Friday at 9:30 in the morning, and it finished at 2:10 in the morning on 2 days later, okay? So these things will take time to render out, but they will look cool if you give them time to render out, okay? All right, and then one more thing I want to show. Let me get rid of the dynamics here. Okay, so I have this. It does that, right? Like that little weird ripple right now because it just has the plane on there. That's all it's doing. Okay. I'm going to adjust my plane effector so that it doesn't do that. Let's just scale this for now. And we'll say, oops, this, -1, -1, there we go. And I will switch that around so it goes the other way. Positive X, there we go. Okay, so now that's a pretty okay animation. I'm gonna give this a little bit more spacing here. I think it's a little bit too tight. There we go. Oh, that's a little bit too loose. Okay, so this definitely works for a transition. It does what it's supposed to. It comes in. But just to add a little bit more to it, I'm going to go to this Voronoi. I'm going to go to my MoGraph effectors, and I'm going to add this, where are we at? Delay. That's what I want? Yes. On the delay, I'm going to go to the mode and change this to spring. And what it's going to do is instead of going right to it, like here's the start, here's the end, it'll actually kind of like bounce around it. Okay, so instead of just like being there, we'll see this kind of like wiggle where it settles. So we'll rewind and play again. And now you get this cool like ripple that kind of follows it along. I'll enhance that effect a bit. Ooh, that's way too much effect. There we go. Right? So that's much more dynamic, much more fun of an animation. Okay? Just by adding that delay, changing that to spring, and adjusting the strength, we can get some different results with that. And I think that that looks definitely much better. And then, of course, things like how big this linear field is, that comes into play too. If this is tighter, the animation happens a lot faster, so that spring effect is going to happen a lot faster. So then we may have to adjust it. That's not a big deal. Now this is where you'll be able to really see the details when you get these chunky pieces. Oops, wrong button. Let's turn motion blur off for a second. That's weird. Why aren't you adjusting? No. Let's rewind then hit play again. There it goes. I don't know why it wasn't updating before. I'm still not updating perfectly, but whatever. This is where you'll be able to see stuff like that ambient occlusion, because if you look at this crevice here, this is pretty bright. It shouldn't be pretty bright. It should be pretty dark there. Once I add that in there, we're going to get this darkness that's going to make it look a lot more apparent. It'll be like really cool how it does that. Okay, and once it does it to the whole thing, you'll get that similar effect to, where was it? No. This one. Oops. That one there. So you can see as these pieces are kind of rotating and scaling, you get that kind of like ripply effect to it. And without the ambient occlusion, these would be gone. You wouldn't really see that detail. Those are what make it pop, plus having that motion blur on there. All these things kind of working together to get that to work, okay? And obviously you want to check your stuff before you render. If this render took me 30 hours to render and then oops, I forgot to put that background, I probably should have checked that before I rendered it out so that I don't screw it up like I did, right? Apparently I did forget to do that. That's fine, I'll render it out. Okay, so there's a couple more techniques. Once you have all of your stuff done, this is all you're going to do to them. You're going to go into After Effects. You're going to find your renderings. That's the wrong folder, 2510, title, renders. I put each of my renders in a different folder. Okay, so these are all different ones that I have. I'm going to go to this one. I'm going to grab the first one, just like we did on our room, and import it. I'll say ignore and hit OK. Double click the next one. Go to my renders, go to explode forward, let's say. Make sure it's on the sequence. Go to my next one. You only have to have 3 of these. I'll grab squiggles this time. No, I don't want squiggles. I guess so. Whatever. All right, so I have all 3 of these. They're all 960 by 540. One of these I rendered out bigger, but that's fine. I'm just going to drag these 3 down to this new comp button. Yes, make sure it's on one of your objects. They all should be the same size, so that shouldn't matter. Make sure sequence layers is clicked, and then hit OK. And then I just have to resize this one because it's a bit too big, so I'm just going to scale it to 75%. There we go. And then it'll just play 1, 2, and then 3. Okay, and then you make that into a movie and you're done. You'll turn in your project folder without any of your rendered images. I don't need any of the rendered images. Just to give you a, for instance, this folder right here is 300 megabytes for this rendering. If everyone has 3 renderings, that's basically a gig per person. I don't need 20 gigs of files on my computer for no reason. I need your cinema file, I need your movie, and I need your folder structure without anything else in it, okay? Any questions on that? No? All right.